Welcome to Machiavelli and the Ivory Tower. Our guest today is Dr. Ulrich Kühn, who heads the research area on arms control and emerging technology at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. He's also a non-resident scholar in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment and a co-convener of the Belfer Center's research network on rethinking nuclear deterrence. Uli, thank you so much for making time in your busy schedule to join us. We're delighted to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So Uli, let's jump right in. You recently edited and published a great new book called Germany and Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century, Atomic Zeitenwende, or A Changing of the Times, which came out just a couple of months ago with Routledge. For those in our audience who maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet, it covers the history and the status of some of the debates around nuclear weapons that have really resurfaced in Germany following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, but also in conjunction with some statements that Donald Trump has made that kind of raise doubts about the future of the US commitment to NATO and to extended deterrence. Can you kick us off by telling us a little bit about kind of your motivations for putting out this book, who your target audience is, and whether this was part of an effort to maybe raise the nuclear IQ in Germany?
Sure. And again, thanks for having me here. This is great. I really like your podcast, and I'm super. I was really keen to be on it. Now I'm here. That's good. And I'm here with a topic that is seldomly discussed in the nuclear field. That is the nuclear actor Germany, and I think that should change because there are a couple of reasons to actually look at nuclear Germany, so to say. And those are the very same reasons that pushed me towards the idea of putting together this edited volume on Germany and nuclear politics. So basically three motivations. The first one was that it's been a very, very, very long time since someone has taken a deep, comprehensive look at the nuclear actor Germany. In fact, it was my very good friend, the late Catherine Kelleher, who wrote the last comprehensive volume on that topic, and that was back in 1975. So believe it or not, that's almost 50 years ago. Unfortunately, Catherine died last year, but she could contribute the foreword to my book. So I thought it's high time, to change that. The second point was that recent years have seen a renewed scholarly interest in the nuclear actor Germany, and that was kicked off mainly by the so-called Euro deterrent debate. And I think in a second or so we can dive right into that and talk about what that means and what it not means. But also about certain developments very indigenous to Germany, like, for instance, nuclear phase-out. Germany got rid entirely of its civil nuclear infrastructure and all that stuff. So there was already this scholarly interest to which I could connect that volume. And the third one was that, well, there's this profound feeling of change happening in German foreign and security policy, obviously as a result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So a lot is changing, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz has coined the term Zeitenwende, which is sometimes misunderstood because sometimes people think it means that, this is the kind of policy that Germany will now pursue. But what he was in fact saying was that we're going through a period of profound change, and we don't know where that change is leading us. So it's more of an almost passive position, standing or sitting there and witnessing that something is changing around you, which forces you to adapt to it. And I thought, well, that means Germany will have to adapt in the nuclear domain as well. But what does that mean? What does that actually mean? So hopefully three good reasons to put together this book. And I was able to line up a great bunch of authors for the book from Germany, from abroad, from the academic realm, but also more from the think tank realm, because I think that's something that's happening not too often, that these two speak to each other. And yeah, and the audience, well, hopefully, I would say scholars, policymakers, and the interested public. That's that's the triumvirate I'm aiming for.
That's great, Uli. You just noted that the book is both for the public and for scholars, and we'll come back to that in our last question in terms of how to bridge the divide between those two. But let's dive right into this notion of Germany, or nuclear Germany has to adapt. So the book has chapters on both Germany and NATO's nuclear posture. And just for those viewers or listeners who are not familiar, Germany is a so-called dual capable aircraft country, or DCA country. Just by way of quick explanation, NATO's nuclear posture relies on forward deployed US nuclear weapons in Europe, and a number of NATO allies contribute these so-called dual capable aircraft to the alliance, and those aircraft are equipped to carry nuclear weapons in the event of a conflict. So Germany is a DCA country, and so we have sort of analysis on that in the book. But then there's also this whole debate about Germany and alternative deterrence arrangements that you just hinted at. Do we maybe need a Franco-German bomb, or even a German bomb in a future in which Germany can no longer rely on the US forward deployed nuclear weapons? So can you just give our listeners some notion as to the current state of that debate in Germany, and really what are the viable options that we're talking about here?
Okay, thank you, Hannah. It's a difficult question to answer, and it needs a bit more explanation about what is actually going on in Germany. And also, does it matter, or is it just an inner German thing? So first of all, I would say that there is no real debate on nuclear deterrence in Germany. There is a lot of talk and chit-chatter going on. Sorry?
Puppets by various...
Yes. Everyone who has an opinion is actually writing down his or her opinion on the matter. That's true. And it's not really a question of, do the people actually know what they're talking about, but it's also kind of like a crowd pleaser, because people love to hear these things. I mean, just imagine, the Germans going nuclear. Oh my God. It's like, that's something that people like to read and people like to write about. So again, I would say there is no serious debate in Germany. However, there are a couple of changed factors. And a couple of weeks ago, published a piece in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and the headline that the Bulletin chose was actually quite fitting. It was saying Germany debates nuclear weapons again, but this time it's different. And that's true, because Germans are not debating nuclear deterrence or alternative deterrence arrangements just since the invasion of Ukraine. They're actually doing this since late 2016, the first time that Donald Trump entered the White House as US president. So since then, a couple of things have changed. The first thing is the security environment in Europe has changed. We don't have Trump anymore. We have Biden, which is really a gift in terms of transatlantic unity, but at the same time, we have Putin and we have war in Europe. So it's clear the security environment has gotten much worse, and we might even face a security environment where we not only have Putin pushing from the east, but perhaps Trump coming from the west saying, let's abandon Europe, I don't care, America first. The second big change is that compared to the early debates about deterrence alternatives, now we have real political heavyweights from all parties in Germany involved chiming in. At the beginning, it was just pundits, and most of them did not matter, but now we have real political heavyweights. Let me just mention two completely different figures, like the former German foreign minister from the Green Party, Joschka Fischer, he is in favor of a euro deterrent, and sometimes he implies in his op-eds that he might be thinking about a German deterrent. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the ultra-conservative leader of the opposition, Merkel's party, Friedrich Merz from the Christian Democrats, who might become the next chancellor next year when we have general elections in Germany. Another thing that has changed in Germany is that disarmament, which used to be a central pillar of German nuclear policies, has become a complete sideshow since the start of the Ukraine war. There is a newfound hawkishness in the German discourse, particularly in the media and amongst think tank pundits from Berlin, the so-called Berlin bubble. Accusations of self-deterrence whenever someone just mentions that there are escalation risks or maybe nuclear escalation risks involved once you have a proxy war with Russia, are leveraged to silence people. And finally, there is a shift in public opinion where the public is not that critical anymore about nuclear weapons like it used to be in Germany for decades. So to address your last point, what are the viable options? I would start the other way around and say what is not viable at all. The so-called euro deterrent, the European Union having oversight over a nuclear arsenal, perhaps the arsenal from the French, which the French, as they are, they donate it to the Europeans. They give it to Ursula von der Leyen, say, we don't need it anymore. You take it, Ursula. That's a no-go. That's not going to happen. Macron's speeches going on since a couple of years, his so-called offers, I would say they're not enough because it's not clear what the French really want and it's not really reassuring what they're offering. A German deterrent at the moment is not an option. I said at the moment is not an option, and we can talk about that in a while. And there are many open questions involved as regards the French and the British nuclear arsenals. Are they enough? Do they or can they really fulfill a so-called extended deterrence function? How would they work together? Is there perhaps room for a trilateral format involving the Germans or another country in Europe? Those are the kind of questions which I think it is worth talking about. And perhaps once Donald Trump gets elected in November, and there is a serious chance for that, then perhaps we will have to talk about these issues.
Lee, this is so interesting. I want to pick up on something that you just mentioned and maybe drill down a little bit on kind of the unit of analysis or the level of analysis. So you were just mentioning the fact that in the past, there has been this kind of significant constituency in Germany that maybe supported an end to Germany's status as a DCA nation and the withdrawal of these forward deployed US nuclear weapons from Germany. You've alluded to the fact that this is maybe no longer the case, but I wonder if you can help us understand whether that is a perspective that's shared by German elites, if you can generalize about them as a group, or if there are significant differences there in public opinion and what policymakers think that maybe we should be aware of as observers.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. It's very difficult to give any kind of definitive answer here, and I think we should be modest in our assessment. The first thing is that we have not seen that many polls amongst German about the nuclear portfolio since the start of the second Ukraine war in February 2022. A couple of things have clearly changed. We see that the German public, for the first time since decades, is now in favor of the extended deterrence arrangement with the United States, meaning the United States has deployed a number of possibly 20 so-called B-61 gravity bombs in Europe. Hanna just pointed out, that the mechanism of this arrangement with the United States, where the Germans provide the aircraft for it. That was always something that Germans wanted to get rid of before the war, just get rid of it, no matter what. And clear majorities for it, sometimes 70, 80, 90%. Or people would say, okay, let's sign on to the TPNW. That's the new treaty, you know, the treaty banning nuclear weapons, which would mean, of course, Germany would have to get rid of the extended deterrence arrangement with the United States. Now, for the first time, a majority is in favor. And I would say, come on, that's understandable. I mean, people have seen the mass atrocities that Russia has committed in Ukraine, particularly against the civilian population. They do witness that for some reason, NATO states are pretty safe. Don't tell me there is not at least a correlation here to nuclear deterrence. People recognize that. And so they say, okay, this seems to be working. Let's keep that. And at the same time, they're not in the mood to think about alternatives. So whenever you ask questions like, okay, should the Germans do something with the French? Should they pursue their own deterrent? Then an overwhelming majority of Germans still says, no, those are not good ideas. We should not have our own nuclear weapons. We should not do anything as a so-called alternative. Let's just stick with what is working. A rather conservative approach, and I would say a largely understandable approach. So in that regard, I would say in a way here there is a kind of chasm between what the elites at the moment, or parts of the elites in Germany, are pushing, and what the electorate or the majority of Germans wants. But you know, the public matters and elites matter as well. And it's clear to me that a certain strand of the German security establishment has been pushing this debate since, I mentioned earlier, late 2016. And I think they have been pretty successful, but they also had the biggest supporter in that game. That was Vladimir Putin himself. Because obviously, you know, he provided the threat that made everyone in Germany recognize that still nuclear weapons are around, and yeah, they do matter in world politics. So elites do have an influence. So at the moment, I would say it's not clear where that is really going. But I would say that the German public is more or less reflecting pretty well what is going on in real life politics. Perhaps one last remark here. One of the authors to the book, Michal Ondercho, made the point that don't be too certain about mood swings, meaning that they're definitive or whatever. They can be just swings and they can swing back. And he provides a couple of examples for that. So we might simply see the German public becoming a little bit more hawkish on nuclear issues. And once we see a settlement of the Ukraine war, they might swing back to their older position and be again staunchly anti-nuclear.
That's great, Oli. And as you just noted, probably the future trajectory of the war in Ukraine will have a bearing on where public perception is going on this. But let's move from public perception as a potential inhibitor of Atomic Zeitenwende to another inhibitor, and that is technical and technological capacity. So the question as to whether Germany, from a material point of view, is actually ready to implement any kind of Atomic Zeitenwende, especially in light of Germany's nuclear phase-out that you have written about, and Germany's abandonment of latency. So tell us a little bit about the technical and the technological state of play in Germany today, and the extent to which this may be an additional inhibitor to the Atomic Zeitenwende.
So let's be clear about this. Talking about this array of topics is gonna be necessarily based on scenarios, and it's gonna be based not on a full-fledged menu of available facts. So there is a lot of speculation here, and one has to necessarily point that out at the beginning. And I think also it's important for scholars to critically reflect on themselves. The moment you start engaging and thinking about these scenarios, of course, you become part of the debate, and you might add to that debate with consequences that might not be the ones that you would like to see personally. I personally started to engage in these issues because I think it is necessary for Germans and Europeans to have an informed discussion about nuclear deterrence. I don't like superficial debates. I don't like where people pretend they know stuff, but they do not know their stuff. I do believe in a democratic principle that if you give the electorate enough information, they are going to be able to make their decision. Sometimes I think elites are treating the electorate too much as a, as a block that is not very well informed. I don't believe in that, to be honest. So I believe that the purpose of a scholar is to find facts, lay them out, and then let people decide what they start doing with that fact. It doesn't say that I don't give recommendations in the end, but the facts are the important thing. The most important issue when we talk about Germany's technical capacity is surprisingly not the fact that Germany has phased out civil nuclear energy, that they have gotten rid mostly of all the serious ingredients of nuclear latency, particularly when it comes to the nuclear fuel cycle. But that we don't see a serious debate in Germany about whether German proliferation, and that is always implied, or it's in the background of these op-eds and whatnot, it's never been defined whether German proliferation should happen out in the open or as a clandestine effort. Because these two things are very different, and they are influenced by a couple of factors. The first one is if you as a state decide to pursue an open proliferation strategy, it means that you're certain that the ramifications, particularly in terms of security, are not that severe or that you can sustain them. And I think that's not the case in Germany at the moment when we look at the security situation in Europe. I mean, you guys both are big experts on Russia. Please tell me that Russia would idly sit by and say, sure, let the Germans proliferate. We don't care. I mean, let's just look at the history of the Cold War. The NPT, one of the main drivers was always that the shared fear of the Americans, the Russians, also the French and the Brits and some others, that the Germans would go nuclear. So I think that's simply not in the cards. Well, and then there's the question, if you want to have a clandestine proliferation strategy, can you actually sustain that? And I doubt that. I seriously doubt that. There is an article in this edited volume of mine that I wrote together with Barbara Kunz, who is now heading the European Security Division at SIPRI. And we really looked into these options from the mindset of saying, okay, let's accept for a second that the Germans really want to proliferate. Okay, what is there in terms of the material? What can they do? What do they have to think about? And we just come to the conclusion that it's almost impossible, I would say it is impossible, to proliferate from a German point of view right now with all the restrictions in place that Germany has signed up to. Even if the Germans would somehow, the German leadership say, no, all these policies, all these ideational factors, they don't count anymore. Let's forget about this. It's all about hard power politics. We're gonna proliferate. Still then, let's just talk about the material. We calculated with the help of a couple of physicists in my team that Germany could get the material, highly enriched uranium, for some 15 to 20 nuclear warheads rather quickly, probably between 2 to 3 weeks. We don't know what the German capacity to build a modern assembly device is, assuming there is no knowledge or no capacity in that regard. Germany could perhaps build a very rudimentary gun type of weapon that would be possible within a rather short time frame. But then again, what? First of all the safeguards in place from the IAEA and whatnot, from Euratom, they would be triggered. People would recognize that Germany is doing that. And before I go on for too long, what about the subs? Germany has not the relevant submarines for that. Germany has subs that can go deep enough, but they don't have subs that are silent enough or that can go long enough. That's the point. Germany has a couple of private companies that are engaged in research on ballistic missiles. Some of those could be modified, but that would take a couple of tests. I would bet these tests would not go unnoticed. And so on, and so on, and so on. Of course, no plutonium at the moment. So I just don't see it. Or, as I wanted to point out in that chapter together with Barbara, the costs and risks involved are incredibly high.
Uli, this is great. We've been highlighting here a number of different barriers, drivers that could inform the debate around the utility of a German bomb, for example, both in an elite discussion and among the general public. And you've laid out a number of these for us to think about. I wonder if we zoom out a little bit. Obviously, Germany is not the only country that's kind of having these conversations about the future of deterrence. We think here about South Korea, we think about Saudi Arabia, we think about Japan. Is there a degree to which the conversation in Germany or the case of Germany is useful for understanding some of these bigger proliferation dynamics that are at play here? Or is that case so unique that it doesn't really help us to try to extrapolate some insights or lessons from what's happening in Germany to some of these other countries?
I would say the answer is yes and no. In a way, the German case is rather unique. Let's just mention that the steadfast opposition to all things nuclear. And by the way, that starts already in the late 1950s in Germany. It goes on at the local level, particularly in southern and northern Germany throughout the 1960s. Then it really takes off in the 1970s. Big demonstrations, protests in the 1980s, and so on, and even throughout the 1990s with the so-called caster transports. That those were the casts where there was the material that was brought from the civil nuclear energy plants. So this kind of, there is no country in the world where there has been this level of continued opposition to all things nuclear, meaning military as well as civilian. Second, this history of shredding German latency. And I have tried to describe this history in one of the articles of the book. It's actually a fascinating story because it starts way earlier than people would think. Everyone connects the German phase out to Angela Merkel and her government, but the real decisions about getting rid of German nuclear latency, they do happen in the second half of the 1980s. When Helmut Kohl was chancellor, when the Cold War was not officially over. Back then already, due to a combination of economic failures, a really bad policy of subsidizing from the state the nuclear power plants, but also, the looming end of the Cold War, all that played together where it became just a logical conclusion for German leaders to say, let's get rid of all that. Let's not forget, back then Germany was sitting on the largest pile of plutonium in the world of a non-nuclear weapons country. So this is another factor where I would say, from this country that built up this massive amount of nuclear latency, then shreds it or starts shredding it at a weird time, then gets rid of it in an orderly fashion towards the late 1990s under the chancellorship of Gerhard Schröder, and then under the impression of Fukushima gets rushed by Chancellor Merkel with no security discussions involved at all. I had a longer chat with Wolfgang Ischinger, the former chairman of the Munich Security Conference, about this issue, because he was still in office at that time, and I asked him, has there ever been any security discussion about this? Not security in terms of, are these German plants secure, but what does that mean security-wise to get rid of nuclear latency? And he said there was never a single word. We did not even discuss it once. So this was happening in an obviously very benign security environment. And I think this is an interesting story. It's a story that no other country shares. So again, that's the point why this is unique to Germany. And of course, then there is this rather unique German approach to constantly balance deterrence and disarmament, to constantly make sure, you're a NATO DCA country. Yes, you say yes to extended deterrence. Yes. But of course, you also go to the TPNW meeting of states parties as an observer, and you say nuclear disarmament. This is what we stand for. Well. Many opinions on that role that Germany is playing. So that's also rather unique. But I said yes and no. So the other side of the coin is that certain things are not that unique, I would say. Obviously, the view of the public matters, as we said before. Clearly, elite interests matter, and that's not very different to other countries. And also not that different to other countries like South Korea and Japan is the big independent variable in all that debate, and that's America. The future of America. What's the trajectory here? Is the US pivoting to Asia at the expense of Europe? Is America perhaps pivoting away from world politics? Is America overstretched? I don't know. Whatever the debate is or the viewpoint here, the big independent variable is America, and there is no difference here in the debate between Germany and South Korea or Japan or other US allies. That's basically the same.
That's great, Uli. I do want to quickly come back to something we've now talked about a few times, which is this balancing act between commitment to nuclear deterrence on the one hand and then nuclear disarmament. I wrote down that earlier in the conversation, you said that disarmament has become a bit of a sideshow with the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and subsequent developments. Yet Germany did decide, as you also noted, to attend the TPNW meeting of states parties as an observer. So let's talk a little bit more about this balancing act between commitment to nuclear deterrence and disarmament, and where you see that going. Do you think that the Germans will sort of try to straddle between those two poles, or do you think it's sort of further going to shift over into commitment to nuclear deterrence and really just sort of paying lip service to the commitment to nuclear disarmament? Where do you see that going, sort of at the level of policy making on the part of the German government?
Yeah, Hanna, that's the big question. I think that everyone who is concerning himself or herself with German nuclear politics is asking himself at the moment. That's clear, because I would say that, a couple of weeks into the war, the Ukraine war, the German vice chancellor, no, sorry, she's not a vice chancellor. Sorry, the German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, she made that statement where she said that, we will have to learn that nuclear deterrence and nuclear disarmament have to be thought of as complementary. And honestly, everyone in Berlin understood what that meant. It did not mean here's deterrence, here's disarmament, complementary, 50-50, same level. Everyone understood that complementarity could mean something like this, you know, a lot more deterrence and much less disarmament.
I'm very glad that this is a video cast and not just a podcast, so people can actually see you gesturing to show that not quite equality, but complementarity. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, I discussed it with my team the next day when she was putting out that speech, and I just said, you know, guys, I mean, just be aware that you really understand what she's saying here. So that's the first thing. Again, I want to point to my book because I think it contains a very intelligent answer to that question, and that comes again from my good friend Michal Ondercho, who had been consulting the work of a German political scientist, Stefan Meyer. And Meyer had this, he wrote down this two-pronged model of control and democratic policy making, which boils down to responsiveness and responsibility. So now it gets a little bit scholarly, and I hope we're not boring the listeners of the podcast. So responsiveness basically means you're the government, there is an electorate, and you know the electorate has ideas and wishes, and you have to be responsive to what they want, because otherwise you will just not be reelected. At the same time, there is a level of responsibility. And responsibility means that states, and particularly democratic states, often find themselves bound through international institutions, for instance, like NATO, where you are responsible not just for yourself, but also for the members. So the case of German politicians debating to get rid of the DCA arrangement is a point in case. There was a clear wish from the German electorate, the German public, get rid of that arrangement. These weapons have to go. So you want to be responsive, you listen to it, you discuss it favorably, and then you go to NATO and you find out that no, in terms of responsibility, you cannot do it because it would undermine solidarity in that organization. It would put you in a very bad corner. It would put others in a less secure position. At least that's what they're feeling or thinking. So perceptions matter. And you have to take all that into account. So how do you balance that? And the idea is that in his article, Michal goes on to point out that German responsiveness in the nuclear domain can take on forms of symbolic adjustment. And symbolic adjustment is a term that he borrows from Thomas Risse, from an early article of his from the early 1990s, wherein certain political practices create a semblance of responsiveness without accepting the core demands of the electorate. It's a little bit kabuki. So you just show to the public certain actions and say, look, you see, I am responsive. I'm listening to what you're saying, but at the same time, where it really matters, you do something else. And I think this is what has been happening in the nuclear domain, and particularly with the new government coming into office in the winter of 2021 to 2022. That was the time when Germany made two decisions. Let's prolong our participation in nuclear sharing by buying the new F-35 from the United States. And at the same time, let's go as an observer, of course, only as an observer, to the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW. The latter action does not really hurt you as a German government. It does not really change anything. You can even go there and say, I disagree with you guys. But the first one, that's a material fact, and it changes policies for years and perhaps even decades to come. And that's, I would say, a clear example of symbolic adjustment. To be clear, I don't think it means that Germany is simply a hypocrite. It just means that German politics has understand that now, for the time being, there is simply not that much room for nuclear disarmament and nuclear arms control. It does not mean that they're entirely giving up on these issues, but it's in a let's wait and see position. And hopefully, as those ones like I myself, who likes arms control and thinks that it's a solid instrument for international conduct in the security realm, as I hope that it comes back, but perhaps it will take a bit of time. And until then, we will see more acts of so-called symbolic adjustment from the Germans.
That's so great, Uli, and that brings me to the final question for today. So just sort of to take stock in terms of what we heard today, we have scholars, we have policymakers, and we have the public. So you just argued that perhaps the relationship between policymakers and the public on the nuclear front might be characterized by a responsiveness that takes the character of symbolic adjustment. Earlier in the videocast, you noted that you see it as the responsibility of scholars to provide facts, to provide fact-based analysis, so that the public can actually make up its own mind on those issues that we're discussing. So I want to ask you about the relationship between scholars and policymakers, the policymaking community, and people like us, experts who work on those issues. And this is a question that we ask all of our guests. How do you see that engagement between those two communities? Because arguably that should also be important for what's then sort of what transpires to the public. Do you think that the policymaking community and scholars or the expert community are engaging in a constructive fashion on nuclear issues these days? Do you think anything could be done to bridge the divide between the policymakers and the experts in a more constructive way? Or sort of what's your take on that issue?
Perhaps that's the most difficult question towards the end. But yeah, why not? Let's try to tackle this. And by the way, I was thinking about the title of your podcast, and it led me back to my final exam in political science that I had on Niccolo Machiavelli, and you know how he provided what today we would perhaps say was policy advice to people in power, but how he was also forced to provide that policy advice and put into jail for not providing the right advice. So there has always been, I would argue, historically seen a bit of an uneasy relationship between the expert, or let's call it the philosopher in that sense, and the people in power. But let's talk about the current situation, and also particularly in Germany. First of all, I think that one of the major things that would have to change in the German context is that we still have more or less two camps of experts in the German discourse, in the German scholarly discourse. And those two camps rarely speak to each other. It's the more deterrence-leaning camp, and it's the more disarmament-leaning camp. And I try to bridge that divide in my book, and have authors more from the one camp and have authors more from the other camp. But it's also something that in a way is happening also in the German Bundestag. That is, when we look at the power elites. German politicians have loved to engage in long speeches about nuclear arms control and nuclear disarmament, and warning of the dangers of breakdown of nuclear arms control. But you find almost no discussion in the German Bundestag about nuclear deterrence, in terms of why do we need it? Do we need it? What sorts of nuclear deterrence do we need? What's the relationship to conventional deterrence? What are our options? Are there things that worries us, or that we need to change? That's all very, very badly developed. And perhaps one of the biggest shortcomings in Germany in that regard is we don't have dedicated academic chairs in Germany at German universities that deal with these issues. It's not like in the US, where I can name, I don't know, 50 chairs right away that are dealing with these issues. In Germany, there is not a single chair in the social sciences that deals, for instance, with WMD, not a single one. And I think that's bad for the country. It's bad for students that are interested in these issues, and it's really bad for the debate, because it means, again, that we will have a lot of shallow arguments, a lot of talking about each other, but not talking to each other. Just as an example, there was an article a couple of weeks ago in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, one of Germany's main daily newspapers, a quality newspaper, that made the case that, you know, Germans have to relearn their nuclear IQ because they are so skeptical about nuclear deterrence. And obviously that's wrong. I mean, come on, that's not the way to go about it. The point is that you will have to lay out the arguments in favor of nuclear deterrence as well as against nuclear deterrence, or why it is actually a system that is built on a very, very dangerous conception of the world and dealing with very dangerous weapons, by the way. And then once you have laid out all these arguments to the public, perhaps the public then can engage in a better informed discussion. But it's not like, okay, I'm telling you what I think is right, and once you know that, you're informed. Yeah, I raised your nuclear IQ. Good for you. That's not how it works. So Germany is suffering from a lot of shortcomings when it comes to discussing nuclear issues. And perhaps one last interesting detail from my book, because maybe there is a way to bridge the divide between these two camps, the deterrence camp and the more disarmament and arms control leaning camp. In the book, I find out that no matter from which camp the authors came, they were dissatisfied with German nuclear policies. The ones were saying they are not doing enough on nuclear deterrence. The others were saying they are not as staunchly committed to nuclear disarmament as they should be. And perhaps, obviously, that's simply a result of the geopolitical situation we find ourselves in. But perhaps it's also an expression that the German approach of balancing these issues, of making everything right, of making sure that everyone is happy with the German approach, is simply not working anymore. And that Germany will have to face a couple of really tough decisions in the years ahead. And that's something where hopefully we can start to have a more fruitful debate in the next years to come. And it's that reason that I'm always hoping that it's the next generation of thinkers on these issues that are now they're starting their seminars at the universities, and perhaps in a couple of years they will not find the same acrimonious debates that we're having currently right now in Germany.
Uli, what a great optimistic note to end on. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I have to say, on a personal level, it's a little bit unusual for me to be the only non-German in our conversation, and it's opened my eyes in so many ways, in addition to giving me the opportunity to perfect my pronunciation of the word Zeitenwende. So thank you both for that. I hope all of our listeners and viewers go out and buy your book because it's terrific. And thank you again for making the time to be with us.
Thanks so much for having me.